Basin of the meditation will be up on the screen or on page 9 in your worship folder. Craig probably asked me if I had a theme to this sermon, and at the time I probably did not, so it's not written out there for you. But put down the University of Hard Knocks or the School of Hard Knocks. That's basically what we're going to be talking about, and I'll explain more about that in a minute. For now, from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, one of the most autobiographical sections of the entire Bible. St. Paul writes in this way, "Therefore, in order to keep me from being conceited," and right before that, he had listed why he might possibly be conceited. He was an abject opponent of the Christian faith. In a miraculous way, Acts chapter 9, God converts him from the number one enemy of the church to the foremost proponent of the church. God enables him to do miracles. God enables him to write and to preach in a way that has never been matched. God gave him visions, and he saw heaven. That could go to your head, right? So that's what he means when he says, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. I believe, and Lynn, my wife over here on the right, you can ask her later on, but I believe it is exactly 3 years this month, this week, that we moved to Sioux Falls. Very wise of us, right in the heart of winter, to decide to pack up in Denver and move to Sioux Falls. But 3 years we've been here. Lovely city, I like it. Not as big as Denver, I like it, but it's got choices amongst coffee shops. I can find Starbucks in 4 or 5 different places. I like Sioux Falls. Far more cosmopolitan, far more ethnically diverse, far more of a foodie place. I laugh at you guys who live here when you say there's traffic. There is no traffic here. So I kind of like Sioux Falls. A lot of history, a lot of churches. And yet, if you look at the statistics on it, do you know the numerical figure of the percentage of people who attend either a Catholic or Protestant church on any given Sunday in your community? What do you think, 20%? 30, 50? Close. 12. You're actually above average. U.S. as a whole right now, somewhere between 10 and 11% any given Sunday sitting in either a Catholic or Protestant church. You're at 12%. Even with all the churches that you see around, even with the perception, man, we live in South Dakota. This is God's very own country. Why would you not go to church, right? It's a little over 1 out of 10 people who actually attend a worship service on a weekend here. Now, why is that? Oh, you don't have to go any further than Genesis chapter 4, where already sin came into the world. Adam and Eve had children. One of the kids killed the other kid. And then we hear about abject heathen who just reject God. And that's been going on ever since. So some people don't go to church simply because they reject anything to do with God. Some people will say, I acknowledge God, but there's neither the time nor the need in my life at this point to interact with God. Some people will say, well, I've got a university education. How could I ever believe in God? That would require faith. And because I cannot have scientific evidence in front of me of God's goodness or his power or proof, I will not believe. And then more typically, the reason people do not go to church nowadays, and so many have fallen away, is they will say, I was raised as a Christian. I still kind of believe in a God. I just don't see the need for it right now. And often as not, what stands behind that is that people will finally admit and say, God let me down. God let me down. I had a bad experience at church. Ever heard that? Anybody here ever had a bad experience at church? Yes? Because you were hanging out with dirtbags. What did you expect? Are these the perfect people of heaven? No. Pastors can be stinkers. They can get legalistic and start making rules and running like it's a dictatorship, right? Leaders can get a sense of my importance and start being that way. People can clutch their coffee and make it a circle of five, and you cannot penetrate that as a visitor and be welcomed because people don't know you. Why would they talk to you? This goes on all the time. You have bad experience in church. But more typically than any of the reasons that I just mentioned, people get this idea that health and wealth theology, which is probably the number one religion in Protestant America over the last 200 years, the idea that if I love God, go to church, give an offering, pray the right way, live the right way, God will bless me. And I'll be immune to any problems. My checkbook will always balance. My children will behave, even the dog will behave. That's American Protestant theology, typically. And we find out it doesn't quite work that way. And so it occurs to us, God let me down, therefore I will stop going to church. And I will not interact with him anymore. Somewhat what is being addressed in here is St. Paul saying to his generation and to our generation, what did you expect in a fallen world? Your life will be a constant learning as you experience hard knocks. It is a school, a university, a continuing education course of how to learn with the fact the world is a fallen place. St. Paul is no dummy. He had a degree, raised in a Greek form of education in which you start handling what we would call philosophy, psychology, geography, already at the second or third grade level. Raised later on as a young man and as a 30-year-old man as a student of Gamaliel, the preeminent Jewish rabbi during the lifetime of Jesus and later. And as if that weren't enough, just in case he needed to make any money, because philosophy and Jewish knowledge wouldn't generate a paycheck, he also picked up a trade. He could make tents and was apparently pretty good at it, because wherever he went in the Middle East, he would set up shop, he would preach, he would talk to people about Jesus, and then at night he made tents to generate some income so he could stay alive. All of which is topped only by the fact that St. Paul learned in the University of Hard Knocks how to deal with the fact that he was a victim of living in this world just as you and I are. And he had troubles and problems and challenges and moments of doubt. Boy, did he have problems. So the school of hard knocks, let's begin by understanding, along with St. Paul, we as believers are not immune to the reality that the world is a cursed place. Paul was no exception, already pointed that out. He's given visions, the ability to do miracles, insights, profound intellect, both spiritually and also culturally. Listed all those things in those verses 1 through 6 that I read before. And then how does he reflect on that? Why did bad things come into his life? According to verse 7, to keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. We don't know exactly what St. Paul's talking about when he said a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan. The tradition that's come down to us, or by reading between the lines in some of his autobiographical letters, some have thought he's talking about epilepsy. He's talking about the fact that he had a stutter, or that he would stammer sometimes when he was trying to speak. Perhaps he had a lisp, that he wasn't communicating clearly. Some think that the problem was that he limped. Some say it's no more profound than the fact in his name, Paul, which means little man, that when he stood up, he wasn't much to look at. He's maybe 5'2", 5'3". Who's going to listen to that? 6'2", 6'3", I'll listen to the big man, right? We do not know what the problem was. All Paul says is, it torments me, and God, for goodness sakes, it keeps me from being a more effective missionary. Therefore, please take it away. Not once, not twice, 3 times he pleads with God, Lord, if you're smart, let me tell you how to run your church and make a better missionary out of me. Fix it. And all 3 times, God stonewalled him, kind of like I stonewalled the kids and say, no, you can't have a cookie right now. Not time, not wise. I think it's probably good for us as adults to get over our Sunday school perceptions of what's actually recorded in the Bible when we read about these human beings, these giants of faith, and we put them up on a pedestal and say, my goodness, these are real people. Job, who's probably a contemporary of Abraham, and some say he lived even earlier than Abraham, and becomes a model to Abraham of what faith is supposed to look like. Job is known as the wisest man in his part of the world, as the wealthiest man and the most successful man. And yet, what's the reality of his life? He lost it all. He had 10 grown kids, all of whom were killed in a tragic accident that God permitted to come into the world. The wealthiest man in the world, he lost it all because thieves came and took all of his herds. Healthiest man, we don't know exactly what. It's simply described as the man had scabs and wounds, and he sat there on broken pottery, scraping the wounds, and his wife said, why don't you just curse God and die? Get over it. Friends to support him. Did you ever read the book of Job? What a miserable lot of friends. Oh, you lost everything because you're a loser or you did something wrong, over and over and over again, right? Flash ahead 1,000 years, King David, raised up by God as a teenage boy, going to be the future of the most powerful kingdom in the Middle East. And yet David, through his own stupidity, marrying 8 different women will do that to you. Serial adulterer, brought some of it on himself. David experiences the death of grown children and an infant child as well. David experiences, even as the king, what it's like to be turned out because they attempted to assassinate me and I needed to flee like a fugitive to preserve my life. And he lives amongst the heathen tribes that he used to kill and that he fought with and won all these victories. He has to live there because his own people have said, no, we don't want you as king. Or against St. Paul. Very real life he had. Wasn't easy. Threatened constantly, no matter where he went, imprisoned on occasion. He says, I was shipwrecked many times. I was freezing cold. I was hungry. I was imprisoned over and over again. Tortured. Whipped. These are real people. Believers live in the school of hard knocks, and probably the first thing that we need to affirm that's as true in the 21st century as it was in the first century. Our kids get hurt in a fallen world. Sometimes our children die, young or grown. Accidents happen. Cancer's real. Getting fired happens. Friends forsaking you, family infighting, and the killer of all of them, the body breaking down. In this section, God readily says to us, it happens. You live in a fallen world. You can categorize those as messengers of Satan, or the prince of the world is having his way, as St. Paul says. They're there before us to say, this is not the Garden of Eden. This is not what God intended. This is not what heaven will be like. This will be a constant dealing with and learning from the hard knocks of life. Once we acknowledge that reality, then you begin to gain perspective on how Paul learned from God what we also need to learn, how God views these things. Not that he sends them to us directly, but he does allow the devil to have his way. And these things do enter into our life. We are not immune. Verses 8 and 9. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But the Lord said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul recognized, I'm not above God. I'm not God's equal. I am under God. God permitted this to come into my world. I asked him to take it away so I could be a better missionary in his church. God said no. Why? First of all, because God says, I don't need a human being with a perfect life to be my missionary. If that's what I needed, I'd have sent angels instead of human beings. I want imperfect people in my church. And secondly, he says, I permit this because I want you to grow through your misery in your reliance on me. That's God's intent. Hard as that is for us to comprehend, God allows these things to come into our lives so that we grow in our reliance upon him. The biblical evidence is there. Go back to those same 3 individuals. Let's start with Job. Lost his grown kids, lost all of his wealth, lost his health, lost the respect of his friends. Who knows how his marriage was even going when his wife says, why don't you just die? In the middle of it, well, what does he say? Though God slay me, yet I will trust in him. David lost the respect of his wives. One of them left him. The others, who knows what they're doing? They're probably fighting over who gets to be chief wife this time. Lost a young child, lost grown children, kicked out by his own people, hunted down by his own son who wants to take over his kingdom, lives amongst the heathen that he used to fight against. In the middle of that, David in his Psalms writes, not once, not twice, but several times, oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he's merciful. And St. Paul, prison, shipwrecked, loss of respect. Jews won't listen to him. Gentiles won't listen to him. They rioted in Athens. They rioted in Ephesus, wanted to kill him. Paul says when he writes to the Romans, all things work together for good to those who love God. It's significant that he writes that to the Roman church because a few years after that's written, Paul is in Rome, he is in prison, and those members of his church get to watch as Paul is put in a serious prison this time and then is executed. And yet the man says, this too works together for good for those of us who love God. Why? Because the grace of God is sufficient. God's goodness is sufficient. It is difficult for us to comprehend how ongoing struggles can make us resilient and actually be a blessing. And before I get to the God answer, let me pull something from social science that was published recently that will maybe help you appreciate what's being said here. Let's start with social science. A lot was written about the World War II veterans who fought the war, men and women, sometimes called the greatest generation. You ever heard that term? Greatest generation. Got through the Great Depression, fought World War II, came out victorious. Most of them are dead now. Not so much had been written about the Korean era soldiers and the soldiers of Vietnam era. But once there's no more people to tell to you directly about World War II, you start interviewing those people. And you've heard what a miserable war Vietnam was, right? You ever heard that in many ways Korea was even worse? Military people say that. But you've known people who were in Vietnam. Perhaps some of you even were in Vietnam. You know what a miserable thing that was. Here's what the study found recently that was published. 61% of all those who fought in Korea and Vietnam, but especially amongst those who were actual prisoners of the war, 61% said, in the giant scheme of things, it turned out good. It helped me live my life more resiliently and more beneficially. That's social science. Pales in comparison, but gives a little bit of a clue as to what God is saying here. That in the midst of trials and tribulations that every one of us suffers, even as a Christian, God says, this is for your good. Again, verse 9, the first part. He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness. There is, in fact, an adversary. Whoever stepped away would like to see you trip up and join him in hell. It is, in fact, this fallen world where things just don't work. And you are part of the problem. In fact, when you look in the mirror, you see an abject sinner. And yet God says to you, my grace is sufficient for you on all three levels. As regards you, he says, I've taken your narcissism, your ego, your pride, your arrogance. I cursed them. And in the moment that my son suffered hell, the guilt was gone. That's why he was able to say, it is finished. You stand as my child. The fallen world, it's reality, he says. That's why he says to us that our life is but a breath. And then you turn over to Revelation 21 and 22 and see what he's actually got in mind. Eternity and endlessness, where you just hang out with him and get to be in the presence of God. And as far as the accuser, the archenemy, who says, oh no, God, remember that sin from when they were 16 or 24 or 10 minutes ago? They deserve to be in hell with me. And God says, I take the accuser and I chain him and I put him in hell, and his accusations do not stand. This is grace. That God takes it all and says, I remove it, and I smile at you and call you my child for eternity. My grace is sufficient for you. So we're not immune. God says, my grace is sufficient to help you endure, and eventually, what we call the School of Hard Knocks or the University of Hard Knocks, you graduate. You really do. If any of you trained to be teachers, your education certificate really means nothing until you start teaching, right? If you train in the medical field, it really means nothing until you actually start helping people with their pain or manage their diseases or perform an operation. In the same way, if you go to the School of Hard Knocks and you are enrolled in it, if you go to there, you kind of graduate, you kind of get it when you begin to do something and you begin to say something. How does St. Paul depict that? Verse 9, the second part. Here's when it says he's got his diploma, he's graduated. I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in my weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. I think a lot of you know what I do for a living. I try and help churches get started. I try and fix churches. I'm in 20-some different states. I go to North Carolina tomorrow. Next week I go to Montana to help with a new start there. I don't know what's been accomplished over the last 18 years of doing this. I can't prove you statistics and say this is the good that's done. But I think sometimes I've learned more from these people and these congregations than what I've ever taught them. And I think I've learned from a number of these people what it means to be resilient and to have graduated from the School of Hard Knocks. My parents encouraged me to go into ministry. They didn't force me, but they encouraged me when I kind of chose that path eventually. I did not have parents who mocked me for going into ministry, but a young pastor I've been working with for a number of years, his parents, from the moment he graduated high school and said, I'm going to go to a college to prepare to be a Lutheran pastor, and I'm going to go to seminary, they mocked him. They effectively cursed him. Why would you do that? You got brains. You could do something meaningful in the world. You could generate money. You're going to be a Lutheran minister. They continue to mock him even though he's 10 years into the ministry now. He's a profound preacher and a profound writer, and he boasts about the grace of God in a way that I can't hold a candle to. Pretty resilient. Topped only by a lady that I met in the congregation that we restarted in Ohio about 4 years ago. She's a little nervous because we were attempting to do something that I never participated in before. Missouri Synod closed down this congregation. They appealed to us. Would we come help them? They had a beautiful building, but they had 18 people left. Would we help them restart and be really the only confessional church in that city of 50,000 people? And we came around and said, yeah, we're not going to rebaptize you as well as Lutherans. Missouri Synod's good enough baptism. Let's just get right page doctrinally, and then let's have at it. And that was good for 17 of them. One lady said, can I talk to you privately? If we sign on with you guys, if we become Wisconsin Synod, if we're going to be a WELS mission, she asked me, am I going to be allowed to what I've been doing in the congregation? And I said, well, I got to ask, what have you been doing? And she said, I was physically and sexually abused for over 20 years. And I was bitter and angry until I actually dug into the scriptures and got good counseling from a pastor and a psychiatrist. And now I've taken that and I've got my own little ministry. I'm not making money off it, but I counsel others who've been physically and sexually abused. And I encourage them and I read with them and I meet with them on and on and on. Can I still do that if I'm a part of this church? I said, I think we got room for that. I think we'll find a way. And I wanted to weep a little bit because I think I've faced problems. When this lady says, this is where I learned resiliency, this is where I learned about the grace of God, and now I boast in it, of how good God has been to me, that's what's before us today. Not simply that we can say, oh, I guess it was bad karma, or just bad luck, or not my day. No. The evil came into your life, and the stuff happened because the devil wanted it that way, and God permitted it to happen. Why? First of all, so that he could draw you closer to him and you'd lean him on him more than ever before. But secondly, and your diploma, your graduation and from the School of Hard Knocks, that you can boast like St. Paul. In the midst of my problems, in the midst of my weakness, I will boast about how God is good to me for time and eternity. I'd help you to that end.